All right, welcome again. This is Dessa. Before we get any further, I want to make sure that everybody has what they need to fully participate today. If you have any access challenges or requests right now, it says message Naji, but actually you should message Shay, who is with us today. Apparently I used a slide from another day, my apologies. Shay is here to help answer any access questions or work out any tech snafus with you. We do have an ASL interpreter today. Toy, thank you so much for being here. And we have Zoom captions. If you click the bottom right of your screen, you should see some dots and access to those captions. We invite you to please stay on mute when you're not speaking, just to minimize background noise. We are going to use the chat today with the understanding that folks on the video who are using screen readers are probably going to have that on mute because it's going to be very busy and noisy for them. So it's also totally wonderful if you unmute and ask your question verbally when we get to that point. But you are also welcome to use the chat throughout the briefing. If we have an access fail, if our ASL interpreter, for example, loses internet or the captions stop, we're going to stop and we're going to fix that before moving forward rather than leaving folks behind in the name of keeping it moving. We also want to invite you all, as I have been doing, to state your name before you speak if you do unmute and share something or ask a question. This helps the interpreter, this helps with the captions, and of course it helps us all learn your name as well. So can I get some sort of thumbs up, emoji, in the chat, anything like that that lets us know that you're cool to move forward. You have what you need to fully engage today. I see some hearts. I see some thumbs. Fantastic. Love it, love it, love it. Again, if at any point you have any questions, please message Shay from the DDP team and they will help you out. All right, so I want to quickly introduce myself and Detroit Disability Power, and my co-presenter and colleague Kenya is going to do the same. If we can go to the next slide, please. So many of you know us, but real quickly, Detroit Disability Power is a disability-focused social justice organization working to dismantle systems of oppression and build political power. We do this in a variety of ways, mostly through organizing and advocacy work, civic engagement, and one of the main things we actually work on is voting rights and voting access. We also offer a variety of anti-oppression trainings with an anti-ableism focus. We offer programming for our members and larger community. And we also have a fee-for-service consulting program that helps organizations, governments, businesses become more inclusive and accessible to people with a variety of disabilities. So we're doing a lot. We have a fantastic team, many of whom are here today. And so if you ever want to work with us on any of these things, please do. We love collaborating. We're a multi-issue, very intersectional organization. So if you're interested, particularly in voting rights, let's do it. On the screen, there's a really nice picture of a group of activists and protesters from a Black Disabled Lives protest that we helped coordinate in Detroit in the summer of 2020. So the photo is of people holding signs, fists in the air, signing the phrase Black Lives Matter. People have wheelchairs, walkers, guide dogs, and everyone is wearing a mask. So I'm Dessa. I am the Executive Director of Detroit Disability Power. I use she, her pronouns, and I am really excited to give my colleague Kenya a moment to introduce herself as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kenya Flores, and I'm the Voting Access and Election Protection Fellow here at DDP. I use she, her pronouns, and this work is really important to me and something that I'm passionate about as a blind voter who has encountered a lot of access barriers at the polls. So I'm really grateful that all of you are here today and ready to have this conversation with us.
This is Dessa. Thank you, Kenya. We're so glad to have you on the team this year. Real quickly, if we could go to the next slide, I just want to run through some quick goals for our conversation and what's going to happen over the next 50 minutes. So the report that we put out in collaboration with the Carter Center is called Improving Voting Accessibility for Detroit Voters with Disabilities. And several people on the Zoom today were absolutely instrumental in the data collection, volunteer training, data analysis, and report writing of for this briefing, like the report that is resulting in this briefing. And so special thanks to all of you who worked so hard on that. You're going to see how much work it really was to do this, but also the really important opportunities that come out of having data and a report like this. So the goals for today are to share both the process and the results of our 2022 audit with the Carter Center. We want to answer questions and share recommendations for better access in 2024 and forever. And we're also very interested in exploring ways to collaborate. So it's exciting that there are, 60 voting rights advocates and activists on the call today, many from Michigan, but also from elsewhere, because it's very heartening to know that so many people care and want to learn more about how our democracy can be more accessible and inclusive. So to get us there, we are going to spend a little bit of time talking about the purpose, history, and methodology of the audits. We are going to spend some time talking about the data and what it means that came out of that 2022 audit. We're going to talk about recommendations for making poll sites more accessible. And then we're going to have a little time at the end for some discussion questions and ideas. So you can go ahead if you have questions along the way to put them in the chat. And if we can get to them as we go, we will. If not, we're going to try to come back at the end. So if this is an agenda that you're here for, you are in the right place. We are glad you're here. And if we can cut the slides for just 1 minute, I want to just spend a couple of moments talking to you all about why we even did this project. So in 2018, I started Detroit Disability Power after a long time of being an activist and an organizer and a person with a disability. I'm both a wheelchair user and a little person, and I have been my whole life. And it just so happened that as I was starting Detroit Disability Power, there was a primary election in Michigan. And I had recently moved, so I was going to a new polling location. And I was really pleased that I was able to get in. I had a good parking spot. I was able to navigate into the building in my wheelchair, no problem. I signed in, I got my ballot, and then I turned around and there was absolutely nowhere for me to vote. All of the voting booths were standing height, which meant I couldn't reach any of them. And so I turned back to the poll worker at the table, who was a real sweet woman. And I said, hey, where should I vote? And she kind of crinkled up her face and she pushed some papers aside on the table she was sitting at. And she said, oh, you can vote right here. And I said, oh, well, that's very nice of you, but I'm entitled to private voting. And then she turned into not a real sweet woman and got kind of mad at me for being a pain in the butt and was like, can't you just vote right here? And I said, I could, I'm proud of who I'm voting for, but also I'm entitled to private voting. And so fortunately, one of her colleagues overheard the conversation and said, oh, hold on, ma'am, just give me a moment. And he went and he cleared off the table across the room where no one else was, and I was able to vote. So yes, I cast my ballot, and no, it wasn't the most offensive or discriminatory thing that ever happened to me in my life. However, what it let me know is that they were not prepared for someone like me to come vote. They were not anticipating that wheelchair voters or very short people like myself would be coming in to vote and might need a different arrangement for their voting booth. And so, of course, I was kind of fired up about it. I knew that there was 129,000 disabled residents in our city. I knew that more than 80,000 of us had mobility disabilities, and many of us use wheelchairs. And hopefully we were going to show up and make our voices heard through the democratic process. Well, that night, I happened to have an advisory board meeting for Detroit Disability Power. And I told my story to the board. And and this is a group of disabled folks, right, advising how to start a disability organization. And every one of them had a story like that. Every one of them said, oh, well, let me tell you what happened when I tried to vote last year, or let me tell you what they said to me. And we all have different disabilities, and we were all having problems. And that's when I realized, oh, this is not just a DESA problem. This is so much bigger than me. This is something that voters with disabilities are facing all over the place. And this is absolutely unacceptable. So that year we collaborated with Warriors on Wheels and the Greater Detroit Agency for the Blind and Visually Impaired, and we started doing surveys of polling locations. We basically put out a call to our members and friends and said, hey, when you go vote, fill out this piece of paper, answer these questions, and then let us know so that we can start raising awareness to local clerks and other election officials about how to improve access. We did that in 2018, 2019, and 2020. And actually, Rami, if you can show the next slide, we have a couple of maps that we made based on that kind of rudimentary survey method. So on the screen right now, it says inaccessible polling locations in Metro Detroit. This is a map from 2018. So we had a pretty small sample size. But what we did was we noted what kind of access barriers people saw when they went to vote. And then we got quotes from them about the issues. And so I'll just read one of these. It says, the main door to the building with the wheelchair access button was blocked with an orange cone and had a construction barrel. So hence the accessible door was no longer accessible. Another one of these quotes talks about voting machines not being workable, and the other one talks about no wheelchair height voting booth. We can go to the next slide, please. This is a map from 2020. We had a similar system that year, getting volunteers when they went to vote themselves just to check out their polling location and report back to us. We got very similar results in terms of the type of access fails that people were encountering. One person here writes, it took me 45 minutes to vote with the machine because the PSA didn't know how to use it. She mentioned that she'd been trained, but had forgotten the details. Eventually, I was able to vote, but it's not clear if it was printed correctly and counted. She didn't know how to load the paper, so I think mine printed on the wrong paper. So this person tried to use the accessible voting machine, which is required by law to be present and operational, and yet they had to leave not knowing if their vote was counted. Another one is about an accessible entrance not working, and another one is about a deaf voter who had trouble communicating with the poll workers who were not particularly helpful, making sure that they got their ballot and were able to vote. So after 3 election cycles of doing this kind of small scale but very important kind of survey work, and then working with, trying to work with clerks to raise awareness and make some changes, we had the really great opportunity and fortune of partnering up with the Carter Center, who was beginning to do election observation in Michigan in 2022. And shout out to Jordan, who's on the call, who approached me and DDP and said, hey, yo, you want to take this to scale? Like, maybe what we can do is combine forces and do a much larger swath of Metro Detroit and get some real good systematic data so that we can then publish that and really push the issue moving forward. And that sounded great to us. We were super happy to do that. And so Kenya's going to talk in a moment about the methodology for that. But before we do, I do want to take a moment to review real quickly the next slide, which has the laws, the laws that are important for the sake of voting access. So this is not just about quote unquote convenience for disabled voters. This isn't just about quote unquote preferences for us, although I think convenience and preference are quite important on their own. There are federal and state laws that require access at the polls. In the report, there's more detail about this, but just bare minimum info here. Voting access for disabled voters is spelled out in the Voting Rights Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which, by the way, turns 33 this week, so happy birthday, ADA, as well as the Help America Vote Act. And there are state laws here in Michigan that bolster these federal laws, as well as provide mechanisms for filing complaints. So we do have protections for these things. The issue is enforcement. And so there's an education component to that, and there's an accountability component to that, all of which we're going to continue talking about. I'm putting a link right now to the full audit report if you haven't seen it yet in the chat. You can read that on your own time. But for now, I want to hand it over to Kenya to talk about our methodology.
Thanks. So DDP and TCC coordinated 261 audits on election day in 2022. We recruited, trained, and deployed 21 volunteers to conduct the audits. These audits took place in jurisdictions that included diverse demographic characteristics, including race, ethnicity, income, poverty, language, and culture. The audits took place in 15 cities in the 3 core counties of Metro Detroit, which include Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb. On election day, volunteer observers visited 98% of the polling places in the observation zone, including all locations in 12 of the 15 jurisdictions, which is pretty incredible for doing all of this in one day. The volunteers completed a checklist designed by DDP and TCC to evaluate the interior and exterior of each location. The observation team assessed the existence or lack thereof of the following at each location: an accessible parking area with a clear pathway to the building, an accessible entrance, a fully accessible voter assist terminal, VAT, and an accessible booth for casting a paper ballot privately and independently. I'm now going to turn it back over to Dessa to talk a little bit more about the data and the findings from the report.
Thank you, Kenya. This is Dessa. If we can go to the next slide, Rami. On the screen now is a map of the 261 polling locations that we audited last November. This just gives you a little visual of the geographic areas that we covered. So of course, most of the places we looked at were in the city of Detroit, because here in Detroit, we have the most polling locations. But there were lots, like Kenya said, 14 other jurisdictions that we looked at as well. Can you go to the next slide, please? And the next slide, please. Thank you. This slide has a list of cities that we went to. And as Kenya said, we covered 98% of the polling locations in these 15 places. You can tell that in some of them, like Warren or Centerline or Grosse Pointe, we covered 100% of all of their polling locations. In a couple of places, we frankly just ran out of time. We had to do this in the 14 hours the polls are open. And so we only hit 99%, for example, in the city of Detroit, or 89% of polling locations in the city of Southfield. But overall, in these 15 jurisdictions, we got excellent data by going to 98% of the polling locations. So what did we find? Next slide, please. Of these 261 polling locations that we checked out, only 16% passed all 4 categories for accessibility required by law. So as a friendly reminder, Kenya mentioned, this includes accessible parking with a clear pathway into the building, an accessible entrance itself, a fully accessible voter assist terminal, and an accessible booth for casting a paper ballot. Again, only 16% of the places we went to passed on all 4 of these measures. And, you might be wondering like, well, what if they were good on 3, but not 4? That's better than being good on none of them. But given that all the features identified are necessary to ensure that voters with disabilities have equitable access to voting, a polling place was only considered fully accessible if it met all the criteria. So we didn't do like a ABC kind of scoring. We did a pass-fail kind of scoring because it's that important. And because voters with disabilities are so diverse that our needs are diverse. And so it would be uncool to say, well, the VAT didn't work, but they had a wheelchair height voting booth, so it's all good, right? We have different disabilities, different access needs. Therefore, all of these things are particularly important. We can go into the next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about the questions that observers were answering when they went to each of these sites. So the first category, as we've said, is a fully accessible parking and pathway. So they would get a passing score if a polling site had yes to both of these first 2 questions. The first question is, were they clearly marked accessible parking spots? The second is, was the path from the parking space to the building entrance paved and clear of stairs, narrow doorways, and physical obstacles that would make it hard for a wheelchair user or visually impaired person to enter. So, the observer would start in the parking lot and work their way into the building answering these questions. The second category has 4 questions and requires the last 3 of the 4 questions to pass, and I'll explain why in a moment. So the third question here is, was the wheelchair accessible entrance to the building the main entrance or a side or back entrance? So there's nothing that requires the main entrance to be the accessible entrance on election day, although that is preferable, right? Just having to go to a different door is not usually a great feeling. It can also mean that that door is far away, or there's not good signage to get to it. So if everybody's going in one door and I show up in my wheelchair and that main door has stairs, I got to figure out, wait, how do I get in this building? So as long as there is an accessible entrance, it's fine, but it's not preferable to have to go around the back or, try 7 doors before you find the right one. The fourth question here is, was the wheelchair accessible entrance clearly marked? This is also very important. Was the wheelchair accessible entrance unlocked? Also important. Sometimes you'll go to a school or something, the main entrance is not accessible. There is technically an accessible entrance, but it's locked or otherwise unavailable, which means that the building is not accessible. Sixth question, did the doors to get in the building have a button activated opener, or were they light enough to open with one hand? So there are tools to measure how heavy doors are. We use the judgment that if a person could open it with one hand, it was easy enough to open for somebody with a physical disability. The third set of questions here is about the voter assist terminal, also known as the VAT. So the questions here were, was the accessible voting machine set up at wheelchair height, powered on, and ready to use by voters? Did the accessible voting machine have the accessible controller plugged in and ready for use? Did the accessible voting machine have the headphones plugged in and ready for use? Was the accessible voting machine placed to ensure the voter's secrecy? So if the VAT is oriented in a way that the voter's back is to every single person walking by after they get their ballot, anybody that walks by can look over their shoulder and see what they're doing. So we want to make sure that the VAT is positioned so that the voter's back is maybe to a wall. Same thing if you have a wheelchair height voting booth that anybody walking by could just look down upon. But finally, the set of questions at the end were about that accessible voting booth. So was the wheelchair height voting booth for hand marking paper ballots set up and ready to use by voters? Was the wheelchair height voting booth placed to ensure the voter could mark their paper ballot in secrecy? So, I mean, I hope you're getting the sense here that like none of these requirements are actually rocket science. These are pretty straightforward ways to have a building set up so that people can actually navigate the building and exercise their right to vote in a private manner. And we're going to talk more about some of this in a minute, but this is more about intentionality and forethought than it is about something that's very, very difficult to do. We could go to the next slide, please. So here's table 3, which is a summary of the 4 accessibility measures that I just went through, looking at the polling locations and what percentage of them passed or failed on each of the measures. Just a note about this chart, the bottom row is not an addition of the top 3 rows. I know it could be a little confusing to look at, so I'm going to run through this. So out of the 261 locations that we went to, 156 had accessible parking and pathways. That's 60%. Of the 261 locations we went to, only 115 actually had accessible entrances. That's only 44%. Of all the polling locations we went to, only 145 had accessible working voter assist terminals. That's 56%. And of all the ones we went to, only 157 had accessible voting booths, which is 60%. So when you think about a place needing all 4 of those to pass, that's how we came to the conclusion that only 16% of the 261 locations were fully accessible. meaning that 84% left something to be desired. And that's actually really troubling in 2022. Like we should be much farther along in accessibility. I want to quickly read a little bit more to you about what some of these categories mean, to give a little more context about each of them. So most of the polling places that we observed had accessible parking and a clear, most, I'm saying most as in like a majority, right? Had accessible parking and a clear pathway. However, 40%, as you can see, did not. Observers noted impediments like severely cracked or uneven or impassable sidewalks, meaning that somebody with a mobility disability or using an assistive technology would have trouble getting into the building. In one case, actually, an observer witnessed a person falling when their walker was caught on an uneven concrete. I have watched voters with walkers have to go down a flight of stairs with the assistance of a stranger because there was no accessible route. This is not only ridiculous, but also dangerous. Many locations only had street parking, which meant that maybe they had one or none accessible parking spots designated for disabled voters. And, you know, frankly, as somebody who uses an accessible parking spot, if possible, whenever I go out, it is very hard to navigate without one. And I have no doubt in my mind that if somebody shows up to vote and there's no accessible parking, depending on their energy level, how they're doing that day, how crowded it is, they might just go home. And then we lose a voter whose voice isn't heard in the process. In terms of accessible entrances, the lack of accessible entrances was one of the most prevalent issues found in our survey and in our audit. In many entrances, as I mentioned, the main entrance was not immediately apparent. The accessible entrance maybe wasn't the main entrance. At several sites, the accessible entrance was somewhere else and there wasn't good signage directing folks how to get there. I also know from personal experience, it takes a lot of physical energy to find the right door when there are many doors and no signs. And that might be more energy than a person has to spend. At 14% of the polling locations visited last November, entrances had stairs with no ramps, or they had ramps that were blocked by cars or other things that made them impassable. In some cases, places had ramps that were so far away that it was a long trek and therefore probably not actually used by many people. So again, this is dangerous and exhausting and turns off voters. And in terms of the accessible voting machines, our observers also noted a very inconsistent availability of working VATs. Most of the sites had them present, but a lot of them were not in good working order. Several of them displayed error codes or did not have headphones or controllers available. Some had run out of printing paper, which makes them absolutely unusable. In some instances, the VATs were unplugged, and when observers were observed noting that, they were plugged in by a poll worker. In many cases, more than 17% of cases, the VATs were placed in a way that did not ensure secrecy. Again, these are super solvable problems. And then finally, regarding the accessible voting booths, nearly all of the jurisdictions observed did not have fully set up accessible voting booths, making inaccessible voting booths another of the top most widespread and consequential issues of these 4 measures. So in one instance, the accessible voting booth was being used by the chairperson as a desk. That's not why it's there. In other cases, the accessible voting booth was being used to store furniture. Some accessible voting booths were on display and set up, but actually not ready to use. And in 2 sites, the standing height voting booth was labeled accessible, even though there was nothing accessible about it and it was way too tall for somebody using a wheelchair to use. Sometimes when an observer mentioned, like, where is the accessible voting booth, the poll worker said that a booth would be supplied upon request. Again, that is not how accessibility should work. It should be there and ready. So one of the things we want to point out here is that the significant variance in the setup of voting booths and VATs suggests that this is a training issue for poll workers. They may not be having this information adequately emphasized during their training, particularly the right to secrecy part. Again, not rocket science, pretty easy to do, but if you're not actually critically thinking through the process, when you're setting up a polling location, you may not remember to do that unless it's been explicitly stated to you as part of your training. I want to pause and take a breath for a second. And if we can go to the next slide, I want to give just a small amount of context before I hand it back over to Kenya. So something that's important to remember here, along with the fact that most of these are very solvable problems, most of these are actually low cost, no cost problems. A lot of the jurisdictions that failed could have actually pretty easily passed, or at least done much better. So 67 of the polling locations scored no on only one of the 4 accessibility measures. And remember, I said you had to pass on all 4 to get a passing score. So 67 of these polling locations scored yes on 3 and no on 1 of those 4. If they could fix that one thing, that would have actually raised the number of fully accessible polling locations from 16% to 42%. And while 42% is still kind of embarrassingly low, it's really much better than 16%. And when we're talking about making sure voters have access, that's actually a huge improvement, because all of the people who showed up in those places that had a hard time voting, it would have been better for them. So this information, knowing that, you know, some small changes could have actually significantly increased accessibility, combined with the fact that we know that many of the decisions that made these places inaccessible were game day decisions, meaning the way the room was set up that day, and that those things are easily remediable and usually don't cost money, like ensuring the VAT is plugged in, means that we can actually make some pretty significant improvements without the huge like, overhaul of how things are done, right? So in terms of infrastructure and old buildings, that's where cost comes in. That's where it gets tricky to find better polling locations. And that is a significant issue, as you can tell from the data. But there's so many other things that would improve accessibility that actually are not major, expensive overhaul kind of things. And so it's really important to remember that, because the pushback we get from election officials is, oh, they throw up their hands. We can't do it. It's too expensive. The state doesn't support us. Well, you don't really need the state's support to plug in a VAT and make it face the right direction. You don't really need the state's support to have a sign pointing to the accessible entrance. Those are things you can do and actually, frankly, are 100% your responsibility. So we're not trying to overly criticize poll workers. We know that they have a hard job. We know that it's a lot to manage. And also, the voting rights of disabled voters are just as important as anyone else's, and there are laws that need to be followed. And it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be the hardest thing in the world to get much of this right. Real quick, I know I'm saying a lot, and I'm trying to do it fairly quickly so we have time for some questions. But last thing I want to say kind of about the data analysis piece is about polling locations. So here in Michigan, as many of you know, polling locations can be in a wide array of buildings. So they can be in church halls or recreation centers, fire stations. Each of these places has strengths and weaknesses in terms of accessibility. So of the audit that we did, schools and churches made up 75% of polling locations. And then there were 10 other types of civic or community buildings that were used, things like rec centers, office building, retirement homes, and the like. What the data shows from our audit is that overall, fire stations and rec centers were the least accessible polling places. None of them were comprehensively accessible from what we saw. The two buildings, like I said, that were used most, churches and schools, also had barely double-digit accessibility records. So only 12% of churches that we audited were considered accessible, and only 14% of schools. And so the places we're using the most are not actually necessarily meeting the standard of accessibility. The highest performing building type were city halls, but only 50% of them were considered accessible. So, this does, there are real concerns about the type of places that we're using. And two kind of final thoughts on that. You might be thinking, hey, aren't schools and firehouses and other public buildings already required by law to be accessible like year round, not just on election day? Yes, that is correct. Although churches are not, they are exempt from that. But other public buildings, particularly buildings with kind of funding that schools and city halls get, are required to be accessible. And so the fact that they're not accessible is not, that means that there's a much bigger problem. It's not just an election day problem, it's a year-round problem. And so we really have an incentive to improve our infrastructure in general for the sake of the entire public being able to access public space, but specifically on election day, as you can tell from this data. And then secondly, a law recently passed in Michigan that expands where polling locations can be, what types of buildings. And so long as the buildings chosen are accessible, that could actually really help alleviate some of the access barriers. So for those of you working in Michigan who are maybe going to be helping to identify additional polling locations in coming elections, make sure that access is top of mind when doing so that we're not just replicating the problem that we have with the old infrastructure that we've been using for polling locations. So with that, with all of that, I'm going to hand it over to Kenya to share some recommendations.
This is Kenya. So I'm going to walk us through some takeaways and then our recommendations, as well as the impact that remedying all of this can have for disabled people. So as we've seen, the results are pretty abysmal, and people with disabilities are unable to participate equitably in our democratic process. The recommendations we're going to outline are either low cost or free and easy to implement, but will drastically improve the lives of disabled people. We are committed to this work, but we also need partners like you because we can't do this alone. So I'm now going to walk us through some of the recommendations. So our first one is to establish processes for coordination, liaison, and reporting. Coordinating with the jurisdiction's ADA coordinator to evaluate existing and potential polling place facilities for current accessibility and implementation of any temporary modifications that might be necessary. Designating a primary contact person for election-related accessibility topics and facilitate contact for staff, poll workers, voters, and advocates to reach them. This point person should be responsible for confirming accessibility in advance and responding to challenges, especially on election day and during early and absentee voting. Implementing systemic statewide reporting on the accessibility of polling locations. This reporting should be incorporated into the election day process of poll workers whose responses are incorporated into the post-election reporting process of clerks. Reports should go to the Secretary of State and be available on a web portal for public review by the conclusion of the canvass. This also would facilitate additional research into the relationship between race, polling place accessibility, and the population's prevalence of disability. This is critical given the lack of data in this area. Our second recommendation is surrounding training. So clerks in jurisdictions determine how prepared their poll workers are. Training should address poll worker understanding of accessibility accommodations, the proper placement of operation of accessible voting equipment, and the rights and responsibilities of poll challengers. Training should also include a practice election to ensure poll workers understand how to operate the VATs. Exterior accessibility should have we recommend clearly marking the path of travel throughout each polling place with consistent signage, especially if the entrance used is not the main entrance. We recommend coordinating with facility owners in advance to ensure the appropriate entries are unlocked. Doors should not be obstructed and propped open unless there is absolutely no alternative. When propping open a door is unavoidable, ensure that the object used does not obstruct the doorway. Wheelchair users and individuals with other mobility aids must be able to get in and out. Our recommendations for interior accessibility are to provide an accessible seat height voting booth for marking a paper ballot and a movable chair that would allow a voter to vote privately and independently. Ensure that VATs and accessible voting booths are placed to ensure a voter can vote privately and independently. And then to touch a little bit on the impact that implementing these changes would have. So we've highlighted barriers, many of which are easy to address and would allow more disabled people to participate actively in our elections. While this problem is clear and consequential in Metro Detroit, it is not solely a local problem. Data collection around the country shows similar lack of prioritization of accessibility and negative consequences for disabled voters. In 2016, data showed that 60% of polling locations in the US had some sort of accessibility barrier. In 2020, 1 out of 9 disabled voters reported challenges voting, more than twice that of non-disabled voters. If people with disabilities voted at the same rate of our non-disabled peers, that would be 1.75 million more voters in the US. Although we are a sizable part of the electorate, we are often left behind. We should have a voice in who represents us on the local, state, and federal level. If we cannot equally access the ballot, we don't get a fair chance at voicing our priorities and opinions about our communities and those who represent us. Every issue is a disability issue. We need to be able to engage in our democracy to increase the quality of life for the disability community. The problems we've highlighted through this report are not unsolvable problems. In fact, they're very fixable. Fixing them would have a huge impact on millions of people's ability to engage in our democracy and ultimately how well we are represented by our government. I will now turn it over to Dessa.
Thank you so much, Kenya. This is Dessa. Appreciate you walking us through those recommendations and some of the other large picture data that we have from across the country here. I want to open it up in this last 10 minutes to some questions and discussions. Right before we do, I have 2 more slides to show y'all. One is about this resource that we published last summer. It's called the A to Z of Effective Inclusive Campaigns. This is 324 pages of campaign guidance. Some of the people on this call both wrote and helped us edit this really incredible resource. This is about making campaigns accessible. There is, however, a full chapter about poll site accessibility best practices. So, you know, if you found this 1 hour briefing a little overwhelming, you can also get this resource at inclusivecampaigns.org and actually take your time reading through a chapter of best practices. And the next slide, please, is really about what's next. Here in Michigan, we are going to continue working with local election officials to improve accessibility this year and moving forward. We want to continue working with all of you as voting rights activists and organizers to ensure that polling access is integrated into your other voting rights work. This should not be separate. This should be a part of our overall push to make sure that people can fully engage in our democracy, whether they're disabled, returning from incarceration, new voters, English language learners, any of the groups that have barriers to voting. We should certainly be pushing together for greater access and expanded rights. And then, we're working with others on this call from across the country to not only do an audit like this again here in Metro Detroit during the 2024 election, but also around the country. And so I'm so excited that people from various states are here. I know they're here because they're interested in doing something like this themselves in their communities. And so real big shout out to Sarah and Leah and Jordan from the Carter Center who are here. Other folks from that coalition like American Association of People with Disabilities, State Voices, National Disability Rights Network, and others, Civic Tennessee, for example, who are digging in with us, Kenya and I, specifically to figure out how do we replicate these audits and use them for organizing around the US. So super excited about these things. Want to open it up for questions. We do have an ASL interpreter, so if you are signing, she can voice your question. If you can raise your hand to ask a question, that will help us. And we'll call on you. And when you begin to speak, please share your name first. Or if you want to put your question in the chat, we can answer it that way.
And so to get started, there were a couple questions in the chat during the presentation that we can loop back to if that's okay. The first one being, as a poll worker for many years, poll workers are not necessarily trained to work with all voters. Have you had a conversation with the Michigan Secretary of State and Bureau of Elections? If so, what is their response?
This is Dessa. Yes, we have had some conversations. For those of you in Michigan, we have a really decentralized election system. And so there can be some recommendations on best practices made. Clerks are ultimately responsible for what happens in their jurisdictions. And so the training, I believe someone correct me if I'm wrong, happens often at the county level. And I think also at the clerk's jurisdictional level. So there's more local room there for really improving training, although the state can make recommendations from what I understand. And I know, when you get trained as a poll worker, it's like drinking from a fire hose. There's so much information, which is one of the reasons we think there should really be an access point person in addition to general training for all poll workers. There should be a person at each site that's more highly trained so that they can troubleshoot on the election day. Because it is a lot to remember how to use the VAT and what the various rules are. And while everyone should learn that, it's probably more realistic that everyone learns a little bit of that and one person learns a lot. So part of solving problems from our perspective is being fairly practical about it without losing sight of the values behind it, of course. Were there more, Eric, from the chat previously?
Yeah, one other question. If there are plans to help clerks with these trainings or not, particularly in the short term. Yeah, that's a summary of a larger question just for ahead.
We're happy to talk with clerks. In 2019 and 2020, prior to the pandemic, back when Warriors on Wheels, DDP, and the Greater Detroit Agency for the Blind and Visually Impaired were meeting with the Detroit clerk regularly, we were training them. And actually, some of the Warriors on Wheels staff were hired by the city to train poll workers on accessibility. And that was an important step. I would say that it did not increase accessibility as much as we would have liked. So there was some follow through challenges, some commitment challenges, some communication challenges, a lot of room for improvement there. And, you know, we had a briefing for election officials on Monday, and frankly, most of them didn't come. We communicated with them a lot about this report and inviting them to the briefing, and we did not get much of a response. And so any relationships you all have with clerks and election officials that can help us get in the door, that's wonderful. We really appreciate that. I see Ben's hand.
Yeah, thank you, Dessa, and to everyone else. This is really helpful, but also alarming. So thank you for that. Ben Gardner, all voting is local. I want to stick to clerk engagement and polling locations. As we look at early voting sites as a coalition, are there resources that you can provide or trainings you can provide to people so that when they go to their clerks, they can assess whether or not a building is fully compliant?
So you mean beyond the kind of survey that I walked through earlier? Or would that survey be sufficient?
I guess what I'm looking for is, I guess what I'm asking is, like, is there a way that people can be fully trained so that if they're recommending a list of locations, like they can, I guess maybe that might be sufficient. I'd have to look at it. I apologize, Dessa. But like, can they actually look at a building and say Grosse Pointe Park and say that's fully, like, that meets the criteria? Is there some sort of program that we can develop or partner with, come together as a coalition and develop? I'm just trying to think of like how that would be.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. This is that's a great question. So yeah, there definitely is. And I think, you know, to do a full access audit, to make sure the building is in like total compliance is actually a big lift, right? You need a tape measure, you need a scale, fish scale, like there's all these things. If you were doing like a for real access audit. That said, the kind of things that we were measuring on election day are observational, like the parking, the clear path of travel, the width of the door, the heaviness of the door. And those are things that, you don't need to be a certified ADA coordinator to do. And we can definitely talk to you all about how to do that. And it won't be like a major lift. So yeah, let's keep, I think that's important because we are going to be, everybody's going to be looking for polling sites over the next year, and we want to make sure that the right ones are being chosen. We have just a couple of minutes left, and we have, I see Isra and Alexia.
Thanks, Dessa. Hi, everyone. Peace. This is Isra. I'll try to make it as quick as possible because I love contextualizing things. But last year we did, for the first time, trainings for poll monitors where Detroit Disability Power and Warriors on Wheels came to implement some of those disability things that you were talking about, Ben. So that poll monitors are also considering that. And I also, just really quickly, shameless plug, I want to shout out Melanie because I see her on this call. She developed a checklist for these poll monitors so that when they enter these polling locations, they're being reminded of the thing to check. And I also want to shout out Dessa for reminding us to add a couple more questions to that so that when these poll monitors go, they're not having to remember half the training. And all of you know this, when you go to a training, even psychologically, you lose half of it by the time you actually need to use it, unless this is embedded in you year after year. So I just want to uplift that if you are doing anything, make sure there is some type of like Google form. It could be something simple that just asks them, were there stairs? If there were stairs, were there alternative, ways that people could enter, and so on and so forth. So I am more than happy to share the recordings from those trainings last year, and really hope Dessa joins us again this year and next year to do that for poll monitors. Thank you.
Love it. Thanks, Isra. Yes, Alexia.
This is Alexia. I'm curious how it went for your volunteers checking access on the day of. Were poll workers generally okay with that, did folks run into any issues? That's something I've heard a lot in other states, so I'm curious.
Yes, this is Dessa. I can speak to that real quickly. Also noting that we're at time. So, you know, working with the Carter Center was really great because they were super aware of the rules of what an observer can and cannot do and how they need to, you know, operate in the field. And so all of our volunteers went through training. They got credentialed to be challengers, and so they knew what the rules were. And as Olivia is pointing out in the chat now, different states have different regulations about this, right? So we were, you know, I can't speak to other states, but most of the time it was fine. There were some instances where poll workers were like, hey, get out of here, or what are you looking around so much for, or, you know, those kind of things. And in those cases, you know, we didn't push it. You can observe the outside of a building without ever talking to someone who works inside. So we got, you know, maybe that day, or maybe they stood in the doorway and tried to look around without really, you know, pissing anybody off. I think for the most part, it was totally fine. What I will say is it is hard to do this many locations in a single day. It is a real logistical feat. And if it weren't for Jordan and Sarah on the back end, like watching all the Google form responses come in and troubleshooting on the phones, we would have never been able to get such good comprehensive data. So it really takes a major team. And then, because then when there is a poll worker who's being weird, the observer or volunteer has someone to call to say, like, am I doing something wrong, or is this person being weird? So that kind of wraparound team approach was really important for dealing with that. So it's one of the goals of this national coalition is to prepare people with the necessary materials and training to go do this confidently and without breaking any of the rules in the process. With that, I want to put I'll put Kenya and my contact information in the chat. Please stay in touch with us about these things. If you want to be a part of this in any way, please reach out. And again, as Isra was saying, like, let's integrate these kind of questions into the work you're already doing. We don't have to do, you know, 20 separate different programs. We can actually do this together. Thank you so much for coming. And please share the report with others. And if you have any relationships with election workers, we'd love to be connected. Take care. Keep up the good work. Thank you so much.